Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's installment of our virtual education series. We're going to give this a moment as you're all trickling in here, but please get comfy. We have 45 minutes together. Grab a drink, whatever you need, but we're looking forward to this conversation today. Today we'll be talking about how new packaging laws may affect your business. This is a fast-moving space of how extended producer responsibility laws, as it relates to packaging, is moving within state legislatures across the country and ones that have passed recently. So looking forward to diving in. A few items before we get started. First, big thank you to our speakers today, Carolyn and Lynn from A New Earth Project and Atlantic Packaging. These are our sustainability packaging gurus, and we are so lucky to be able to learn from them on all things extended producer responsibility and packaging. My name is Ashley Seward. I work for People for Bikes, obviously. I'm the sustainability lead, and I get to work with incredible experts such as these folks today to learn more about these issues. So thank you again for joining us. Couple more items before we get rocking and rolling. Reminder that this webinar will be recorded, and we'll send you out the recording as well as any resources that we mentioned throughout the call later. There will be time for live Q&A at the end, so please use the Q&A bar if you have any questions, and if you want to use the chat function to share where you're coming from today and introduce yourself, you're welcome to do so. And quickly, a couple reminders about People for Bikes. So reminder that People for Bikes is both the trade association that represents the US bike industry, but we also have a number of advocacy resources that you can take advantage of as well. So here's just a sprinkling of some of our advocacy resources that you can take advantage of. But in addition to this, we also have an extensive list of industry member benefits. Again, I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I did want to give some extra special attention to our sustainability resources that our members can take advantage of, from sustainability policies, such as the items we'll be talking about today, to sustainable packaging, which Carolyn helped with this packaging guide that we created a few years ago. The list goes on and on. But if you are not already a member and you would like to become one, please reach out to rod@peopleforbikes.org or reach out to me and we can get you connected. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen, a couple of those quick items, and I will pass it over to Carolyn and Lynn. Thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, we're so delighted to be here, and welcome everybody. We're happy that you're here participating in this webinar on embracing extender producer responsibility for packaging. I am Lynn Talley with the New Earth Project, which is Atlantic Packaging's sustainability initiative. A New Earth Project is a proud member of People for Bikes, and we so appreciate you all hosting this webinar today. We are here as a resource for all People for Bikes members and anyone else who has hopped on and joining us. Caroline, go ahead and switch to the next slide. So just so you know, during the webinar, we are going to be giving you an overview of EPR and why it is used. We're going to dive deeper into California's EPR laws and also discuss proactive steps that you can take, you and your business can take to be ahead of the transition. As Ashley mentioned before, definitely drop your questions into the Q&A as they come up. We will have a Q&A portion at the end of the presentation to help answer your questions. Next slide, just real quickly, briefly about us. Atlantic Packaging is the largest privately held packaging company in the US. And as Atlantic Packaging's sustainability initiative, A New Earth Project has a real strong interest in helping our customers better understand EPR and its impacts that it will have on your business. So like I said, we are here as a resource, and we're happy to pass on what we know so that you can make informed decisions on your business and business packaging needs moving forward. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our amazing, incredible Director of Sustainability, Caroline Deloach.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks People for Bikes for having us. Really excited to explain more about extended producer responsibility, or EPR, for packaging today. We're going to move relatively quickly through this content just because there's a fair amount of it, and we want to make sure that we leave time for your questions. So just bear with us. I know a lot of people have heard about packaging EPR and they know that they need to be paying attention to it, but people are coming from all kinds of levels of background on this topic. So going to try to go back to basics about what this is and then get a little bit more technical about what you might be expecting from states like California and some of those steps that you can go ahead and take. So first, let's just back up and say, what is EPR? So EPR is a policy approach, and it makes producers of products responsible for the whole life cycle of their product, including the disposal and recycling. And this is really important for a lot of kinds of products, including packaging. So why are we even talking about this in the context of packaging? Well, this is not going to be super surprising to probably any of you, but packaging is the largest contributor to plastic waste. A lot of us know it's creating major problems for our oceans, lakes, and rivers. We're having trouble recycling as much material as we're using. We see a lot of these, what we would call environmental externalities that come from the amount of packaging that we're using, particularly among those single-use plastics. So while we have this massive pollution and litter problem, we have this other problem I just alluded to, which is recycling has only gotten harder. So China stopped accepting a lot of US recyclables back in 2018 because of some really high contamination rates. You may hear of this event being referred to as National Sword. And so part of the cascading series of events that came from that was that a lot of US municipalities couldn't recycle as cheaply as they used to, and some just discontinued their recycling programs altogether. So this was a really big wake-up call to the US and to some other markets that we could no longer just be shipping our recyclables abroad and saying that they were getting recycled when we really didn't have a very good idea of what was happening to them. We were going to need to do a lot more of this domestically. And our recycling infrastructure just wasn't keeping up. It hasn't changed that dramatically in decades. And what's been happening at the same time is while our recycling infrastructure has been sitting still, the amount and complexity of our packaging has only continued to increase. So as you see from this picture, this is an example of a material recovery facility, a MRF, which is where our curbside recycling goes to get sorted. MRFs are often still very manual in the way that they sort packaging. And think of the many, many types of packaging that we're putting into our recycling bins on any given day, especially when we start getting into those like thin plastic films. These are really, really difficult to recycle. Almost no curbside program takes them, and the amount of those plastic films has continued to increase over the last couple decades as well. So for all of these reasons, we've had trouble keeping up with the amount and complexity of the packaging that is going into our economy. So let's talk a little bit about the current life cycle of a package and who is responsible for what parts of it. So all the way from package design to disposal, we have our life cycle here. And at the beginning, when a package is designed, manufactured, and then something is sold inside that package, that's the responsibility of the producer of that packaging, right? But as soon as they sell it to you, the consumer, they are no longer responsible for it in our status quo. Once you buy it, you use it, you have that packaging, you're responsible for it now. You need to dispose of it, hopefully in a responsible way. But of course, sometimes even when we dispose of things in responsible ways, we see things happen like plastic pollution in our environment. We also see that there are significant costs that come with packaging disposal. As a taxpayer, as a citizen, you are paying for the landfilling and or recycling and or composting of various types of packaging products every day. Sometimes this comes in the form of taxes. You may have subscription fees for your recycling or composting, but all of this is to say that once you buy the product that the packaging is coming around, you're responsible for it. And so this means that those environmental externalities, those hidden costs to the environment and to people, are your responsibility as the taxpayer and the consumer. So what is it that we're proposing to change here? Under an EPR approach, this whole life cycle is the responsibility of the producer of the package. And so this is a really fundamental shift. I know that this sounds very theoretical, but like, what would it actually look like for the producer to be responsible for the package all the way through that life cycle? And sometimes what that winds up looking like in our laws is a shared responsibility model with taxpayers. So we're going to start going into a little bit about what does that responsibility look like when we're talking about producers having responsibility for the full life cycle. So I told you already that EPR is this policy approach where producers are responsible for the whole life cycle, and that EPR exists for a variety of products, including packaging, but also things like paint, tires, mattresses, etc. So what does responsibility mean? It often means that the producers are paying fees. That is kind of what the basics of all of these EPR programs are. The producers are paying fees based on the amount and type of packaging that they use. And so there's that financial component of almost like a reimbursement of needing to be financially responsible for the end of life of a package. But sometimes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, depending on the state, the producers may also have what we call operational responsibility for a piece of packaging, meaning they may also be getting involved in the actual practices of recycling or take back programs or reuse and refill, like they're actually part of the supply chain of the end of life of a product. So now would be a very appropriate time for you to be asking yourself the question, who is the producer of a piece of packaging? And this is where we often see initial confusion. So when we're talking about packaging EPR, the producer is the brand selling the packaged product. So it is not necessarily the actual manufacturer of the packaging. It's not the company that you're buying your packaging from right now. It's you, the brand, who is putting your label on the product that consumers are buying. And this is almost always true. There are some situations where sometimes there are retailers or distributors involved, but for the most part, we're talking about whoever's brand is on the piece of packaging. So when you hear me say producers throughout the rest of this presentation, I'm talking about the brands. I'm just using the word producer because in this lingo, these terms of art within the policy world, we're talking about extended producer responsibility. So we want to be very clear about who that producer actually is. So now that we've established that producers are paying fees based on the amounts and types of packaging that they're using, what does that mean in terms of the incentives that are created? So here's our life cycle again. And as I said, the producers are being charged fees based on how much and what type of packaging they use and sell into the regulated geography. So the regulated geography in this case would be a US state that has passed an EPR law. And that's packaging that's ultimately being disposed of. So if you're a brand and you're being charged a fee, you're being charged lower fees for using packaging materials that are more recyclable. Maybe they have more recycled content, perhaps they're reusable. And we call these fees eco-modulated fees, where they're lower for more sustainable materials and higher for less sustainable materials. So what kind of incentive does that create? It creates these upstream incentives to design product packaging that first just uses less material overall. And then for the material that you do have to use, you're incentivized to use packaging that's more recyclable. And again, like I mentioned, you may hear this called eco-modulated fees. So this creates a more virtuous cycle to incentivize brands to use less and better packaging, which in our current model, where taxpayers and consumers are responsible for the end of life of a package, those incentives didn't really exist before. So now there's a clear financial incentive to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like in practice. These EPR programs that you see passed in various states can often look very different, but they tend to have common features. So obviously it's a law, so it's created by some kind of legislation establishing the rules of the program, and it often has targets associated with it. And these programs are managed by what we call a producer responsibility organization, a PRO. And I'll tell you more about what that PRO does in a moment. The whole EPR scheme is guided by what we would call a program plan. And that's basically how the PRO is going to execute on the goals of the law. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second too. I just explained some of those incentives that are created by eco-modulated fees. So those are very much by design in the laws. And then one of the things that those fees wind up going to, that's really important, is they wind up funding improvement of recycling and often also of composting systems and infrastructure. You heard me mention at the very beginning how difficult recycling has become in light of the amount and complexity of our packaging. And so we need to be funding it to make it keep up with our demands on it. And so one of the things that these fees do is help improve that infrastructure so that it can keep up. So let's talk about who's who in this whole ecosystem, because you've heard me mention producers, but who are the other kind of players here? So in terms of flow of money, probably the most salient thing to the people on this call is that most of you are brand owners, producers, and you will be paying fees on what we would call the covered packaging, the packaging that's covered by the law, into this producer responsibility organization, or the PRO. And the PRO is kind of the center of the EPR universe. It is a club of all of the producers. So in some programs, there's more than one PRO. For the most part in the US, we just see one at a time, usually a nonprofit organization. And that PRO is responsible for taking in all of those fees that you, the brand owner, owes on your covered packaging. So what do they do with those funds? It goes to two major places. First, as I mentioned, part of what those fees are doing is basically reimbursing local governments and recycling service providers for the end of life of these packaging products. And then some of those fees and funds are also going to MRFs. Remember, those are the sortation facilities for recycling, and other processors of materials and end markets who turn the packaging into new things. So that's part of that building up of infrastructure that I was mentioning earlier, where the PRO is not only just kind of trying to reimburse for the cost to dispose of packaging today, but also building up that infrastructure for the future. So the PRO is moving these funds between the brand owners, local governments, and recyclers. There are a couple other players here to be aware of. There's also, of course, the state itself. So the state agency is whatever the government body is that is under the state's executive branch that is kind of administering this law. So in California, for example, that body is called CalRecycle. And so they are the government agency under Governor Gavin Newsom that is kind of administering this law. And I told you that this PRO is operated by the producers, but ultimately they are still accountable to the state for the performance of these laws. So the PRO has to submit performance data to the state agency showing that the producers are paying the fees that they're supposed to, that reimbursements are happening the way that they're supposed to, and that infrastructure is improving the way that it's supposed to. And then lastly, you'll see this advisory group up at the top. And this is a really common feature of packaging EPR programs. A lot of the legislation establishes an advisory group for other stakeholders to help advise on the implementation and performance of the law. So in California, for instance, our Atlantic Packaging's president, Wes Carter, actually sits on the advisory board as a representative of the packaging industry, but there are also stakeholders from composting groups, environmental justice groups, municipalities. So it's a group of stakeholders who are kind of trying to help implement the law and make sure that it's performing correctly. So these are all of the players that you're going to see in this ecosystem. So I said that the PRO is kind of the center of the universe in an EPR program. What do we know about them right now? So the Circular Action Alliance is the PRO that has made itself kind of the leader in the packaging EPR space right now, as we know it, with the states that have passed EPR. And it was founded by 20 companies, a lot of the big CPGs like Keurig Dr. Pepper, retailers like Walmart. So it was established very quickly in the wake of the first few laws being passed. And while it is kind of established nationally, they became the recognized PRO in California, Colorado, and Maryland so far. And what we anticipate is that they will continue to be named the PRO in future EPR states, basically with a franchise kind of model. Editorializing a little bit, I think that this is a very good thing because, none of us love to deal with a patchwork of different laws from different states, but at least if we're all complying under the same body that has basically franchises in different states, that should reduce some of that administrative burden. So that's part of the reason we anticipate that CAA will continue to be named as the PRO in these states. So speaking of which, who are these states? So right now there are 5 states that have passed packaging EPR laws. They're the ones in blue here. Maine and Oregon started first, with California and Colorado following the next year. And then actually, as we were creating this presentation, Minnesota passed their law in May. So that's a really recent development. We also have 2 states, Maryland and Illinois, who have passed what we sometimes call a pre-PR bill or a study bill law, and they're basically setting the stage for a future EPR law. And then in gray, we just wanted to highlight on here that there are a bunch of other states that have introduced EPR laws that haven't yet passed, but that may pass in future sessions. So I know that we're in the early days here, but for the states that have passed EPR, I imagine they're very important for your brands in the outdoor industry. Thinking about states like California and Colorado, in Oregon, where we have a lot of outdoor enthusiasts, these are really important states. And obviously California is just a huge economy on its own. It's also hard to imagine that you will be creating different packaging for each of these states. That's why this is having nationwide impacts. There's a saying, so goes California, so goes the rest of the country. And I think there is an extent to which that is true. If you're shipping packaged products to the West Coast, you're not going to design something differently to go to California than you are necessarily to go to Nevada. So this is going to have impacts across the country since we have representation on both coasts and in the middle of the country. It's also important to note that even just of the states that are in blue here, this makes up about 17% of the US population. So almost 1 in 5 people are already living in a state that has passed an EPR law. I will note that none of these states have started their programs yet. They've all passed the law, but they're in the process of being implemented. So you'll see a lot of those future dates on this slide about when the programs start. And I know that some of these dates feel really far away, but this is coming very quickly, and the changes are going to come quickly, even if the consumers are not yet demanding those changes. So don't let these dates feel far away. These are just around the corner, and we all need to be preparing for them now. So let's talk a little bit about California in particular. And part of the reason that we like to do a spotlight on California is because it's such a large economy, but also because it's one of the more onerous laws in terms of its requirements. So as I mentioned, the basic structure of a packaging EPR program are these fees that go to reimburse municipalities and recyclers for the work that they're doing at a product's end of life. But what we often see is that other kinds of targets and goals wind up being tacked on to these laws. You may, if you're ever reading about the legislative process in the news, you may hear them called Christmas trees, because a lot of times people will just start adding their own little ornaments onto the EPR law in the form of recycled content requirements or bans and all kinds of different things. And California is a great example of that. So the goals of the law are pretty simple. They want They very much set out to ensure that producers of single-use packaging, and especially plastic single-use food serviceware, which is not as relevant to this group, take responsibility for those end-of-life costs. And they also really wanted to improve and harmonize the curbside recycling collection programs. Most of us have dealt with some kind of confusion of your municipality has one set of recycling rules, but your neighbors just down the street has something different because they're technically in a different county. One of the goals of a lot of these EPR programs is to harmonize collection across the whole state. Let's just have there be one list for the whole state. And that's really exciting. And so California is setting out to do this under this law. And then you'll see the definition of producer here too. Of course, as I mentioned, ultimately this comes down to the brand whose brand is on the packaged good. But there is an exemption for small businesses with annual gross sales of less than $1 million. And we can talk more about that if anybody wants. On the Christmas tree line of thinking, let's talk about some of the mandates that are in here. So one of the requirements under SB 54 is that all of the covered materials, meaning all of the packaging that is governed by the law, must be recyclable or compostable by 2032. And this is a really big deal. Alongside it, there is a target that 65% of the recycling is actually 65% of the packaging is actually recycled or composted by 2032, with this kind of like stair-step rate as we move towards that date. And that is also a really big deal because, as we know, a lot of post-consumer packaging, especially plastic waste, is not getting recycled today. So this mandate to get up to 65% is a lofty and important goal. There are also some requirements that brands need to achieve 25% plastic source reduction by 2032, meaning you need to eliminate 1/4 of the plastic that you're using right now in all of your packaging. And there's an extent to which you can use post-consumer recycled content, PCR, to do that. There's basically a de facto ban on expanded polystyrene food serviceware. So keep in mind, I'm saying food serviceware, not all EPS packaging. I know a lot of you may be using EPS to ship various items. It's not a ban on that. It's just EPS food serviceware. And then there's also a requirement that plastic producers, meaning the actual like resin manufacturers and brands, are going to be paying a total of about $500 million a year for 10 years in environmental mitigation funds to help clean up the plastic pollution mess that already exists. So these are some of the other things aside from just the basic fees that SB 54 requires. So as I mentioned, this is not yet implemented yet. This is law, but it's not implemented. So what do we know so far and what don't we know as we're getting further into implementation? So as I mentioned, source reduction of plastic, huge priority. Knowing that you have to reduce 25% of the plastic that you're using is a really big deal. We also know that a lot of items won't be able to be labeled recyclable with that chasing arrow symbol unless they are accepted by recycling programs that serve at least 60% of the state's population. So we've seen a lot of brands just kind of slapping that chasing arrow symbol on things willy-nilly without any proof that the item is recyclable or that any programs are recycling it. And that's not going to fly anymore because of a separate law, SB 343, as well as some federal guidelines. Like you may have heard that the Federal Trade Commission's green guides are being updated as well. So we're going to see some changes in labeling. This is on the compostable side, probably less relevant to most of you, but compostables will need to be certified in order to be called compostable. Seems fair enough. We also know that producers will very likely be able to get credit, so to speak, for source reduction that they did between 2013 and 2022 if it's documented. So I imagine a lot of you have been working on reducing the amount of packaging that your products come in already. And the goal of this law is not to penalize those who took steps early before it was mandated. They want to reward you for that. So as long as you can document that you have been making those changes, you should be able to get credit for it. Of course, there's some things we don't know. Namely, we don't know the fees on different materials yet. And we don't know them for any of the US states. The closest thing we can look at are some of the EPR laws in places like British Columbia that have fee schedules posted. But it's very possible that we see very different fee schedules in the US. So we will see. And then we also don't entirely know what happens to materials that don't reach that 65% recycling composting rate by 2032. The law does not say an outright ban on materials that don't reach that rate, but in a way, it's kind of implied. There are ways to gain exceptions to continue using packaging that doesn't meet this rate. But for the most part, right now, the way that the laws and regulations are written, all packaging needs to meet a 65% recycling or composting rate by 2032. So the next steps as the California law is being rolled out is that CAA, remember that's the Circular Action Alliance, which is the named producer responsibility organization in California, is working on registering producers in the various states. They had a soft deadline of July 1st of this year for producers to register, but you can still register. And we'll talk about that in a second. Cal Recycle, which is that state agency that's administering this law, has published a list of those covered material categories. So you can look at that list and see, does my packaging fall under this list? And the answer is very likely yes, it covers just about everything. So let's talk about some of the steps that you can be taking as brands as these laws are being rolled out. So I was mentioning the registering as a producer. So the Circular Action Alliance is asking that any brand that thinks that it's going to be obligated under this law, go ahead and register with CAA. The initial deadline to do so was the 1st of this month, but you can still do so for free. If you're selling anything into the state of Colorado, you must register with CAA by October 1st. Even if you're not completely sure that you're going to be obligated as a producer under these laws, I would highly recommend just going ahead and registering because there's no cost to do so, and you will probably get a better sense later on of if you're actually obligated. So there's really no downside to registering now. It's not like you're going to owe fees that you otherwise wouldn't be owing. And the form takes about 3 minutes. So you'll have access to this deck afterward to click the link in there, or if you just go to Circular Action Alliance .com, it might be .org, then you can register right on their website. Very easy. I also recommend going ahead and gathering your existing packaging data and documenting your existing initiatives. So yes, in the future, you're going to need to be able to turn over data about the kinds of packaging that you're using, and I would have this be at SKU level. But I would also recommend going ahead and gathering that data for 2022, 23, and 24, because the various states are going to be requiring those data sets as they set their baselines. So you might as well go back in time a little bit and see how easy it is or not easy it is to pull a lot of those data. And you may find that you need to make some internal process changes to make it easier for you to pull together those data in the future. And then, as I mentioned, if you've made any efforts to reduce your packaging already or replace it with more recyclable materials, document those efforts so that you can get credit for your existing work. Document, document, document. I would say that is the name of the game with any changes that you have made or are going to make as these laws are being rolled out. So go ahead and move to more recyclable materials where you can. Some of the examples that you see pictured on here are redesigns that we've done at our Packaging Solutions Center here in Charlotte for outdoor brands moving to entirely fiber-based recyclable materials for things like snorkels, skis, and shoes. And go ahead and review which products you're labeling as recyclable. Make sure that you feel confident that 60% of people in these states have access to recycle that kind of packaging, because you may not be able to use that chasing arrows symbol if not. Create alliances and partnerships for managing some of those difficult materials. So we know that a lot of times it's not just as easy as moving to a fiber-based curbside recyclable solution for for your packaging. You may have certain packaging materials that are really, really difficult to recycle, or that you can maybe establish like a take back program for. You may need to create unlikely partnerships, maybe even with your competitors, to the extent that you can, to take some of those products back. So try to be open source and collaborative as you're looking for ways to do that. What we have pictured on this slide is we at Atlantic Packaging established a take back program for some of the pallet stretch film that we are selling. It's not something that is as commonly recycled in kind of the business to business world. And we realized it was something that we were uniquely positioned to take back and recycle for our customers. We're doing that in partnership with some really big companies like Coke. And so we needed to kind of create new partnerships to be able to recycle those materials. Of course, bring your consumers along for the journey. In 2024, your packaging, when done well, is a brand attribute. So let it work for you. As you're making changes, communicate with your customer base about what you're doing and why, and also make sure that you're explaining responsible disposal instructions for each packaging component, whether the packaging is going to a consumer or to another business. And then lastly, I recommend assigning 1 or 2 people on your team to be keeping up with all things EPR, because as you can tell, there's a lot happening. And you don't want to miss some of these important deadlines. Have someone whose job it is to keep an eye on the CAA newsletter, to do that registration. And then you can also check out the state-specific packaging EPR pages. So when you get a copy of this deck, each of these state names and bills is clickable, and it'll take you to the page for that state to learn more about that specific law. But I will tell you that CAA's website is also a wealth of knowledge. And then we at a New Earth project have tried to create a really helpful guide to EPR and other resources to help you stay on top of what's going on. Again, there's a lot that we don't know, but that's okay. This implementation is going to take all of us to do well, and we are happy to be here to answer your questions. So from there, we will jump into Q&A.
I always learn so much every time I listen, and I've heard all of it many times, and every time something new. Thank you so much, Caroline. We have a few questions that have jumped in. This one is kind of a scenario question. There's kind of a two-parter. And it starts with, what responsibility does a distributor have in the scenario? If a brand sells something to a distributor and then the distributor sends it to a consumer or retailer in X state, is the brand or the distributor responsible for the fees packaging? And then the second part, building on that, if brand A sells to distributor B, who sells to retailer C, who sells to consumer D, how does the pro or state agency know if, when, how to charge the brand for the packaging?
Okay, this is a really good question, and it's one that I don't have an entirely satisfying answer for, but it's one that we're going to see more clarity on over the next year or so. So who is ultimately responsible for the fee in these kinds of complex supply chains is going to depend a little bit on the state. But for the most part, what we anticipate is that if a brand is selling something to a distributor, that the brand is still the one who is responsible for that fee. And kind of the principle of all of this is that whoever is making the decision about what kind of packaging to use on their product should be the one who's held responsible for that fee. The question of how the PRO or state agency will know who to charge is, I don't entirely know the answer to that question, to be completely honest with you, but I imagine that one of the things that CAA will do is get a sense of your supply chain mapping, for lack of a better word, to see where your products ultimately wind up. I do think it's possible that if a brand kind of doesn't know that their packaging is being sold into one economy or the other, then how can they know what they need to be responsible for? And that's a really fair question. I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer to that. But what we basically do know here is that the PRO is going to try to charge the brand first. And if for some reason they can't do that, then there will be this kind of like waterfall model of like somebody will eventually be charged, and it might be the distributor, it might be the retailer. They're going to get the fee from whoever they have to. And so what that might mean is that if you as a distributor or a retailer are charged the fee for that package, you might go back to the brand and say, yo, hey, we got this fee for the package that you're putting your product in, we'd like to charge you for it. And so even if it is the distributor or the retailer who winds up getting charged for it, I do think that the brand will ultimately be held responsible. This may be particularly important because some of the brands who are international and who cannot be necessarily held like legally liable in a US court of law for these fees may just find themselves charged by the distributor or the retailer who's in the US.
A few others that have come in around fees. So one is, how are these eco-modulated fees calculated by states? How are the fees determined? Who manages this?
Sure. So different states are going to do slightly different things, but what we're seeing very commonly is that the PRO proposes what they think the fee schedule should be, and then submits that to the state for an up or down approval. So what we're seeing happen right now is that CAA is working on trying to model out what should these fees be. And some of the ways that they are doing that is by saying, okay, what is the average cost to recycle 1 pound of corrugated cardboard? And they will then use that cost to inform what they charge you, the producer, as the fee for each time you use a pound of cardboard. So if you remember, part of the goal here is to reimburse municipalities and recyclers for their costs of operating. So that's going to be kind of the basis of how they think about how to determine what fees to charge. So the fee or the cost associated with recycling a pound of cardboard is going to be a whole lot less, I can promise you, than the fee to dispose of a pound of styrofoam, because styrofoam is really, really difficult to recycle. So I think we're going to see really high fees for difficult to recycle materials like expanded polystyrene in comparison to really easy to recycle or dispose of materials like cardboard. So we're going to see these eco-modulated fees collected by the PROs, when then, as I mentioned, those fees will then get distributed out as reimbursements and investments in that local economy. Do you think that completely answers the question?
Yes, I feel like if there needs to be any clarification or addition to it, definitely chime into the Q&A, and we'll circle back. We have, I think, time for just a couple more. There is one about any penalties or fines if a producer does not register their packaging and sales information. And in addition to that question, do you know how these programs will be enforced?
Yeah, so I don't know what exactly the fines are in each state, but there are fines and penalties, financial penalties in each state if you are not reporting and paying fees on your packaging. You can choose to comply independently of CAA if you just want to register as an independent producer and be paying fees directly to the state on your own. You can do that. Realistically, I don't know why you would do that, because it's going to be a lot easier to have someone else manage it for you. And so registering with the PRO is probably the way to go. But yes, there are fees and penalties in each state.
The next one is, how do we report the packaging data, total weight by material across all brands that we're responsible for?
Yeah, so there's a fair amount that we don't know about that yet, because CAA is still working on standing up their process, but I anticipate that you will provide basically SKU level data by material type for all the brands that you're responsible for by weight. So you'll want to look across all your brands and say, okay, across all the brands, we are using X pounds of cardboard and X pounds of LDPE plastic film and X pounds of tape. And so you'll be providing that in some kind of large spreadsheet form, I imagine, to the PRO, but we don't completely know exactly what that'll look like. Another good reason to go ahead and register with the PRO so you can be hearing when they announce things like what those requirements will be.
It looks like we're right on at 2:45, so I want to kind of be respectful of time. I can grab the questions that weren't answered and we can make sure we answer those questions. So I think, yeah, Ashley, I'll pass it back to you.
Wow. Yeah, so informative. Thank you so much again, Lynn and Caroline. This was really fantastic. Again, we've said it a few times. This is recorded. We will send out the slide deck, the recording, and we'll get these questions out if there was any that were unanswered. But you know, as I said at the beginning, these are the packaging gurus. If you have additional questions, I'll list out their contact information if you'd like to reach out additionally later as well and get in touch. Please do so. But yes, thank you again so much to both of you for joining, and thank you everybody on the call for taking the time this Wednesday. I hope everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, everyone.
See you.
Bye.